He watched her from across the cavernous dining room of the Gilded Lyre, a lion observing a gazelle, not with hunger, but with a deep, corrosive boredom. She was just a waitress, another cog in the silent, efficient machine that catered to his whims. But tonight something was different. The amber glow of a 30-year-old Macallan warmed his veins, and the sycophantic laughter of his dinner companions grated on his soul. A cruel, crystalline idea formed in the wreckage of his ennui. He lifted a hand, a gesture both languid and absolute, beckoning her. When she stood beside his table, he didn't offer a compliment or request another bottle of wine. He pointed a sliver of black carbon fiber, his exclusive Centurion card, at her, the motion saturated with contempt, and said, his voice carrying through the suddenly hushed room, "There's a Steinway in the corner gathering dust. I'll transfer $20,000 to you right now if you can play something on it. Anything at all. Prove you're more than just a pretty face carrying a tray." The room's gentle hum of conversation evaporated, but he, Arthur Sterling, had made a catastrophic miscalculation. He thought he was purchasing a moment of fleeting humiliation to entertain his vapid guests. He had no idea he was about to strike a match in a room filled with gasoline, igniting a blaze that would incinerate the gilded cage of his life. The Gilded Lyre wasn't merely a restaurant. It was a testament to unattainable luxury, suspended 70 floors above the glittering sprawl of Chicago. Its windows were not glass but crystalline walls, framing the city's electric heartbeat against the dark velvet of Lake Michigan. The air inside was a carefully curated blend of old money and new ambition. The scent of vintage leather from the banquettes, the ghost of Cuban cigars from a bygone era, and the earthy, decadent perfume of white truffles. The delicate chime of heirloom silver against hand-painted porcelain was the only permissible music. For the clientele, it was a fortress of influence. For the staff, a theater of impeccable servitude. Alara Vance knew this stage intimately. For 3 years it had been her entire world, a penance she paid nightly. Each evening, she imprisoned her fiery auburn hair in a severe tight chignon, donned the starched, unforgiving black uniform, and sculpted her features into a mask of serene neutrality. Her movements were a study in fluid dynamics, honed by years of a different, more demanding discipline. She could navigate a crowded floor without a whisper, her hands as surgeons as she poured a 1961 Chateau Latour or placed a plate of seared scallops before men who saw through her as if she were made of glass. Tonight, the crown jewel of the Gilded Lyre's patrons held court in the prime corner booth. Arthur Sterling. The name was synonymous with power, a legacy of steel and finance that had shaped the city's skyline. At 36, he was the reluctant king of Sterling Industries, a global conglomerate he'd inherited, not built. He was possessed of a severe, almost punishing beauty, eyes the color of a winter storm, a jawline that looked hewn from rock, and a mouth set in a permanent line of disdain. He wore a Brioni suit that cost more than Alara's annual salary, a vintage Patek Philippe, a subtle beacon of immense wealth on his wrist. Alara had served his table 4 times this evening. He had not met her eyes once. He spoke in a low-clipped baritone, his focus on his 2 companions. A preening socialite named Beatrice Croft, dripping in diamonds, and a weathered-looking older man, his family's lawyer. They were celebrating the finalization of a brutal corporate merger. Their laughter was thin and sharp. Alara moved around them, refilling water glasses, her presence as noted as a shift in the barometric pressure. "The board capitulated this morning," Arthur was saying, a sneer twisting his lips. They droned on about tradition and the company's soul. Pathetic. Everything has a price, Beatrice. Everyone. Beatrice Croft, a woman whose face was a testament to the finest cosmetic surgeons in the world, laughed a tinkling, artificial sound. "Oh, absolutely, darling. But some prices are just for sport, aren't they?" She gestured dismissively with a diamond-encrusted hand. "Look at these people. They exist to serve. What soul could they possibly have left to sell?" It was then that Arthur's gaze, sweeping the room with the weary ownership of a monarch, finally snagged on Alara as she meticulously crumbed a neighboring table. He watched her for a long moment, his storm-gray eyes narrowing. He noted the ramrod straightness of her spine, the controlled grace in her movements. He saw her hands meticulously clean, but with a faint, almost invisible network of calluses at the fingertips, a detail that didn't fit the picture. To his jaded mind, it registered not as dignity, but as a well-rehearsed performance of subservience. The cruel Scotch-fueled idea blossomed. He wanted to prove his point to Beatrice, to himself. He lifted his hand. "Waitress." Ilara's heart did a slow, painful lurch. Being summoned by this table was a walk into the lion's den. She approached, her hands clasped behind her back in the regulation posture. "Yes, sir." Arthur didn't invite her closer. He made her stand at the periphery, a petitioner before the throne. He leaned forward, his voice a low drawl that seemed to absorb all other sound in the room. He produced his wallet and slid out the matte black card. He didn't offer it. He aimed it. "I have a wager for you," he began, the sneer returning. "My friend here and I are debating the nature of value. I contend that everything and everyone can be bought. She believes some things are sacred." He tapped the card on the white linen tablecloth. "There is a magnificent Steinway concert grand over there. A prop, really. I doubt it's been properly played in years. I'll pay you $20,000. Right here, right now. All you have to do is play it for us." A wave of shocked silence radiated out from their table. Ilara felt a hot, prickling flush creep up her neck and over her face. This wasn't a request, it was a public execution. He wanted to peel her apart layer by layer, to watch her weigh her desperate need against her pride, and then to witness her inevitable surrender. He wanted to prove that she, like the company he'd just swallowed whole, was merely an asset to be acquired and controlled. "Sir," she began, her voice a mere thread of sound. "You heard me," he said, louder now, savoring the drama he was creating. "Just a single piece of music. Entertain us. $20,000 for 5 minutes of your time. What do you say? Is your dignity really worth more than that?" Her manager, Mr. Dubois, was already gliding towards them, his face a rictus of horrified apology. But Arthur Sterling was not a man one interrupted. His displeasure could shutter restaurants. Ilara looked at Arthur's face. She saw the cold intellectual curiosity in his eyes, the absolute certainty that he had her trapped in a cage of his own making. He saw a waitress in a cheap uniform. He saw late rent, medical bills, the crushing weight of a life lived on the margins. And he was right. She was desperate, but not for the reasons he could ever comprehend. She didn't think of her drafty studio apartment or her mountain of student debt, frozen but accruing interest. She thought of her younger brother, Leo. She thought of the hushed, sterile corridors of the neurological wing, the rhythmic sigh of the ventilator, the specialist's grave face as he discussed a new, prohibitively expensive experimental treatment. A treatment for a rare degenerative motor neuron disease that was slowly, cruelly stealing the music from Leo's own gifted hands. $20,000 wasn't just rent money, it was 6 months of that treatment. It was a year of specialized physical therapy. It was a fragile, shimmering sliver of hope. Her pride, the armor she had painstakingly forged over the past 3 years, felt as thin as glass. It was a luxury she couldn't afford, but abject surrender wasn't in her DNA. A different kind of fire, one she had banked so low it had nearly become embers, began to glow hot in her chest. She met his gaze, and for the first time, her own eyes were not a neutral, placid blue. They were the color of a stormy sea, deep and turbulent, and they held an intensity that made him unconsciously straighten in his seat. She gave a single, sharp nod. "All right." The word was a gunshot in the silent room. "But not for your entertainment," she added, her voice suddenly clear and resonant, stripped of its waitress hush. She gestured to the gleaming black Steinway, isolated on a small raised dais. "And I'll need you to process the payment first." Arthur's sneer widened into a wolfish grin of triumph. He had won. He signaled, and within a minute, a portable payment terminal materialized at the table. He took the device, tapped his card, and entered the amount with 4 deliberate keystrokes. A receipt for $20,000 spooled out. He tore it off and held it out to her. "Your fee," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. Ilara took the slip of paper. Her hand was rock steady. She folded it once and tucked it deep into her apron pocket. Then she turned her back on him and walked toward the piano. The room held its breath. She began to unpin her hair, the severe chignon unraveling into a cascade of auburn waves that caught the light of the crystal chandeliers like captured fire. She kicked off her sensible black work shoes, her bare feet making no sound on the plush carpet, and then the polished wood of the dais. Every diner, every waiter, every busboy was frozen, watching. Arthur Sterling leaned back in his booth, crossing his arms over his chest, ready for the pathetic spectacle. He expected a clumsy rendition of Chopsticks, or perhaps a halting, half-remembered tune from childhood piano lessons. He was about to receive the shock of his formidable life. Elara sat on the polished black leather bench, the city of Chicago a silent, glittering audience at her back. She didn't look at the keys. She closed her eyes for a single, profound breath. In that moment, the waitress uniform became a costume. The opulent restaurant faded to black, and she was transported to another place. The hallowed practice rooms of Juilliard, the air thick with the scent of old wood, rosin, and fierce ambition. She could hear the voice of her late father, a concert pianist himself, a man whose gentle hands could conjure thunder from a keyboard. "Don't just play the notes, Elara," he would whisper, his voice a warm memory. "Play the reason the notes were written. Let the story flow through your hands." She opened her eyes. The story tonight was one of righteous fury. She placed her hands on the keys, and the first notes that erupted into the silent room were not a melody, but a declaration of war. It was a tempestuous, dissonant chord that struck the air like a bolt of lightning, making several patrons physically jolt. It was the opening of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, but played with a raw, savage power that was all her own. Her hands, which minutes ago had been carefully balancing trays, were now a blur of controlled violence on the keyboard. They flew across the 88 keys, a ferocious, breathtaking display of technical brilliance. Arpeggios cascaded like waterfalls, octaves hammered out a rhythm of defiance. Intricate passages were dispatched with a precision that was nothing short of terrifying. Arthur Sterling's triumphant grin vanished, replaced by a mask of stunned disbelief. This wasn't the clumsy fumbling he'd paid for. This was a masterclass. This was a world-class talent, a ferocious, untamed genius, hiding in plain sight behind a waitress's apron. The patrons were utterly captivated. Forks hung, suspended in midair. Conversations were forgotten. The only sound was the magnificent, thundering voice of the Steinway, expertly commanded. The older lawyer at Arthur's table leaned towards him, his voice a stunned whisper. "Arthur, my God, who is she?" Arthur didn't answer. He couldn't. His mind was reeling. He, a man who curated his life with priceless art, whose walls were adorned with Rothkos and de Koonings, recognized the language she was speaking. It was the language of sublime artistry, born of thousands of hours of devotion and sacrifice. He felt a strange, sickening lurch in his gut. It was the feeling of being profoundly, irrevocably wrong. Elara was lost to the music. The concerto was a torrent of everything she had suppressed for 3 long years. The grief for her parents, lost in a sudden, senseless accident. The rage at a universe that had snatched away her scholarship, her future, and forced her to trade the concert hall for a dining room. The fierce, desperate love for Leo that was the engine of her entire existence. She played the pain of watching her own virtuosity lie fallow while her brother's body betrayed him. She played the humiliation of filling out financial aid forms for his medical care. She played the despair of sleepless nights spent wondering if this gilded cage was all her life would ever be. Her performance wasn't just technically perfect, it was emotionally devastating. She poured every ounce of her frustration, her sorrow, and her unyielding hope into the music. The piano wasn't an instrument, it was an extension of her soul, and it was screaming. For the finale, she built to a crashing, thunderous crescendo, her body rocking with the force of the music. The final notes hung in the air, vibrating with power and passion. And then, silence. She let her hands fall from the keys into her lap. She sat there, her shoulders rising and falling with her ragged breaths. She didn't look at the audience. She didn't need to. Slowly, deliberately, she stood, turned her back to the piano, and her gaze swept over the entire room of stunned faces until it landed, with the force of a physical blow, directly on Arthur Sterling. Her face was pale, her eyes blazing with a cold, triumphant fire. The silence stretched for 5, 10, 15 seconds. It was broken by a single person. The lawyer at Arthur's table, his face a mixture of awe and shame, began to clap. Hesitantly at first, then with firm conviction, he rose to his feet. One by one, table by table, others joined him. The polite applause swelled into a roaring, sustained standing ovation. The titans of industry and the doyens of Chicago society were on their feet, applauding a waitress who had just stripped them of all their pretense. Arthur remained seated, frozen. The applause was a deafening roar in his ears. He felt as if the floor had dropped out from beneath him. He had intended to purchase a cheap thrill. Instead, he had paid to witness a revelation. He had treated a Stradivarius as a common fiddle. The arrogance drained out of him, replaced by a vast, hollow sense of shame that was utterly foreign to him. Ilara ignored the ovation. Her eyes, still locked on Arthur, were filled with a righteous fury that seared him to his very core. She held his gaze for a long, unflinching moment, letting him see the full magnitude of his error. Then she turned, walked calmly to where she had left her shoes and slipped them on. She gathered her cascade of hair and with a few practiced twists, imprisoned it once more in its severe bun, a queen deliberately putting her crown away. Without a word to anyone, not even a glance at her dumbfounded manager, she walked straight past the maitre d', through the heavy glass doors of the Gilded Lyre, and out into the night, leaving behind a room still echoing with applause and one utterly shattered billionaire. The receipt for $20,000 was still tucked in her apron. She hadn't earned it. She had seized it. It wasn't payment. It was reparations. The following morning, Arthur Sterling woke to a world rendered in shades of gray. His usual routine, a brutal 5 a.m. workout, a cold shower, and a review of the Asian market reports over black coffee, felt like a hollow charade. The ghost of the music from the night before still echoed in the minimalist expanse of his penthouse. The image of the waitress, Ilara, he'd learned her name from a stammering Mr. Dubois, was burned onto the back of his eyelids. Her performance played on a continuous loop in his mind. The initial defiant crash of chords, the furious grace of her hands, the profound gut-wrenching sorrow that had poured from the instrument. His world was one of numbers, contracts, and the cold, hard logic of leveraged buyouts. It was a world of polished surfaces and calculated deceptions. Last night, she had ripped through that facade and shown him something elemental and true, and he had tried to slap a price tag on it. The thought churned in his stomach, a novel and deeply unpleasant sensation of self-disgust. "Sir," his executive assistant, a ruthlessly efficient woman named Ms. Albright, said, her voice cutting through his reverie. "The preliminary call with the board of Kensei Corp is in 20 minutes. Legal is waiting." "Cancel it," Arthur said, his voice flat. Ms. Albright, a woman who had never known him to postpone anything, blinked. "Sir, you heard me. Clear the morning schedule, all of it." He rose and began to pace before the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city sprawling beneath him like a kingdom he no longer understood. "I have a new priority. Find someone for me." "Of course, Mr. Sterling. Name?" "Ilara Vance. She was a waitress at the Gilded Lyre. As of last night, I assume she is formerly employed." "Understood. Shall I have a non-disclosure agreement drafted? A severance package?" Ms. Albright assumed this was damage control, the standard procedure for cleaning up a wealthy man's indiscretions. "No," Arthur snapped, the sharpness of his tone surprising even himself. "No agreements. No more money. I need to know who she is. Everything. Education, family, employment history, everything. Use any resources necessary. Private investigators, data forensic teams. I don't care. Be discreet." "Yes, sir," she replied, her professional mask expertly hiding her astonishment. For the rest of the day, Arthur was an apparition in his own life. He sat in his cavernous office, the chrome and glass reflecting a man he barely recognized. He stared at a Gerhard Richter painting on his wall, a masterpiece of blurred, abstract color that usually soothed him with its intellectual coldness. Today, it looked like a pale imitation of the emotion Ilara had painted in The Air with Sound. His own past mocked him. He too had once loved the piano. His mother had insisted on lessons. He had been good, even passionate about it, finding a solace at the keyboard that he found nowhere else in his rigidly structured childhood. But when his father died, the weight of the Sterling Empire had descended upon him. The piano was deemed a frivolous distraction. The lid of the family Steinway was closed, both literally and metaphorically. He had traded art for power, and somewhere along the way, he had convinced himself it was a worthy exchange. Last night, Ilara Vance had shown him the fool's bargain he had made. Meanwhile, the story was already metastasizing. Not from the patrons. Their circle was too insulated, too concerned with maintaining the illusion of decorum, but from the staff. By noon, a surprisingly clear cell phone video, shot by a busboy from behind a marble pillar, had surfaced on the internet. It was titled, "Billionaire bets waitress $20K to play piano. Her response will leave you speechless." The video exploded. By mid-afternoon, it had 2 million views. By evening, 15 million. It was the perfect viral cocktail. A story of class warfare, hidden genius, and a powerful man put in his place. The internet, with its insatiable hunger for David and Goliath narratives, had found its new champion. They called her the Liar's Fury, the Waitress Virtuoso. Speculation ran wild. Was she a Juilliard dropout? A former child prodigy who had vanished? For Ilara, this sudden, glaring fame was a terrifying, suffocating nightmare. She had gone straight from the restaurant to the hospital, sitting by Leo's bedside watching the steady rise and fall of his chest until the morning nurses shooed her out. When she finally returned to her small walk-up apartment in Pilsen, her roommate Maria was waiting, her eyes wide, phone in hand. "Lara, you have to see this," Maria said, her voice a mix of awe and terror. Ilara watched the video, a knot of ice forming in her stomach. She saw herself, a stranger on a screen, her face a mask of controlled rage. The comments section was a dizzying scroll of praise, pity, and invasive questions. They saw an inspiration. She just felt flayed open. Her most private pain turned into public spectacle, just as Arthur Sterling had intended. "I have to disappear," Ilara whispered, her voice shaking. She unplugged her Wi-Fi router and turned off her phone. "He can't find me." "Who? The billionaire?" Maria asked. "Lara, what he did was monstrous, but look at this. Juilliard just put out a statement. The Chicago Symphony Orchestra wants to contact you. These are real offers." "It's pity, Maria. It's charity because some bored monster decided to make a poor girl his floor show," she retorted, pacing their tiny living room like a caged animal. "It's not about the music anymore. It's about the story, the spectacle." The $20,000, which she had already wired to the hospital's billing department, felt like blood money. It was the price of her anonymity. The next 2 days were a siege. Journalists and news vans began camping outside her building. She had to sneak out the fire escape to get to the hospital, wearing a hoodie and sunglasses, her head bowed, praying she wouldn't be recognized. The spotlight felt less like a stage light and more like the searchlight of a prison tower. On the third day, Miss Albright entered Arthur's office and placed a slim, gray file on his polished desk. "Ilara Vance," she announced. Arthur opened it, his heart thudding with an unfamiliar sense of dread. The report, compiled by the best investigators his money could buy, was a life story told in cold, hard bullet points. Ilara Vance, age 25. Their parents. Daniel and Anya Vance, both professional musicians. Daniel, a concert pianist. Anya, a cellist with the symphony. Deceased. Head-on collision with a drunk driver, 3 years prior. Education. Admitted to the Juilliard School, piano performance, on a full dean scholarship at age 17. Considered a prodigy. Withdrew at age 22. Reason for withdrawal. The accident that killed her parents left her younger brother, Leo Vance, age 16 at the time, with severe spinal and neurological damage. Became his legal guardian and sole provider. Sibling. Leo Vance, age 19. Currently in long-term care at the Shepherd Center for Neurological Rehabilitation. Diagnosis: acquired motor neuron disease, secondary to traumatic injury. Condition is degenerative, requiring constant, expensive care and experimental therapies. Employment history. A string of service industry jobs for 3 years. Waitress, barista, coat check attendant, all positions allowing for flexible, often nocturnal hours to accommodate hospital visits. Financials. In excess of $600,000 in medical debt. No significant assets. Scholarship fund from Juilliard was forfeited upon withdrawal. Arthur read the report 3 times, each word a blow to the gut. The cold facts painted a picture far more devastating than any piece of music. A prodigy who had sacrificed her entire world for her brother. She wasn't playing for her pride that night. She wasn't playing for his dirty money. She was playing for a life. Her brother's life. The shame he had felt before was a pale shadow compared to the tidal wave of revulsion that crashed over him now. He hadn't just been arrogant. He had been monstrously cruel. He had taken a woman's unimaginable private tragedy and turned it into a spectacle for his own cynical amusement. He closed the file. His famous decisiveness, his killer instinct in the boardroom, had deserted him. He had no idea what to do. Sending more money would be a grotesque insult, a confirmation of her worst opinion of him. An apology felt pathetically inadequate, but doing nothing was unthinkable. "Cancel the rest of my week, Albright," he said, his voice hoarse, "and get me the entire board of directors for the Shepherd Center on the line. I want to talk to them about their underfunded research wing." He was no longer just searching for a woman. He was searching for a way to reckon with the hollow man he had become. Finding Alara's apartment building in Pilsen was a simple matter for a man with Arthur's resources. Approaching it was one of the most difficult things he had ever done. He'd traded the Brioni suit for dark jeans and a simple charcoal gray cashmere sweater. A futile attempt to look less like a corporate predator and more like a human being. He drove himself in an unassuming black Tesla, leaving his chauffeur and his Rolls-Royce behind, and parked half a block away from her walk-up, with its colorful murals and weathered brick facade. The neighborhood pulsed with a life and vibrancy that was entirely alien to his sterile world of glass towers. He stood on the sidewalk for a full 10 minutes, watching families come and go, trying to assemble the right words in his mind. None came. He finally walked up the steps and pressed the button for apartment 3B. There was no answer. He tried again. Silence. Just as he was about to turn away, the main door creaked open, and a young woman with vibrant purple streaks in her hair and a sketchbook under her arm came out. It was Maria, on her way to an art class. Her eyes widened as she recognized him instantly from the viral video. A look of pure, unadulterated hostility washed over her face. "You!" she spat, planting her feet firmly in the doorway, blocking his path. "You have an incredible amount of nerve coming here." "I need to speak with her," Arthur said, his voice quiet, stripped of its usual command. "Please, it's important." "So you can humiliate her some more? Throw another pity check at her?" Maria shot back, her voice a protective hiss. "She's not here, and if she were, she wouldn't want to see you. You've turned her life into a 3-ring circus. There were news vans here all day yesterday. Do you have any idea what you've done to her?" Arthur had the grace to look ashamed. "I know, I made a mistake. A terrible one. I need to apologize." "An apology isn't going to make them go away," Maria said, but his visible contrition had chipped away at her righteous anger. She let out a frustrated sigh. "Look, she's not here. She's at the hospital, Shepherd Center, with her brother. Now, for the love of God, just leave her alone." She pushed past him and hurried down the street. Arthur stood there for a moment, the name of the hospital confirming the file. His resolve hardened. He wouldn't ambush her there. That was sacred ground, but he knew she had to come home eventually. He would wait. Hours bled into one another. The afternoon sun gave way to the cool hues of twilight. Arthur sat in his car, conducting billion-dollar business deals from his phone with a detached efficiency, his texts and emails as sharp as ever. But his mind was elsewhere. It was on a Juilliard prodigy, on a brother whose hands could no longer make music, on the crushing weight of sacrifice. His own life had been a seamless ascent, paved with inherited wealth and ruthless ambition. He had never been forced to sacrifice anything of meaning. Finally, just after 10 p.m., he saw her. She was a small, solitary figure, walking down the street, wrapped in an oversized coat that seemed too big for her frame. Her auburn hair was tucked into a simple beanie, her face pale and exhausted in the orange glow of the streetlights. She moved with a weary tension, her eyes scanning the street for journalists. Arthur got out of the car. Her head snapped up and she saw him. She froze, a deer caught in the headlights. Her hand flew to her coat pocket, her fingers clenching around her keys as if they were a weapon. Every trace of exhaustion vanished, replaced by a rigid, defensive hostility. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice cold and brittle. "Miss Vance, Alara." He began, taking a cautious step forward. She took a deliberate step back. "I came to apologize." "You came to my home," she corrected, her voice trembling with a tightly controlled rage. "You had me investigated. Don't add insult to injury by pretending this is a chance encounter." Arthur stopped. She was formidable. "Yes, I did. I needed to understand." "Understand what?" she shot back, her voice rising. "That people like me aren't props for your amusement? That our lives are more than just a line item on your balance sheet? Did your expensive investigators tell you that, Mr. Sterling?" "They told me you were a prodigy," he said softly. "They told me what you gave up for your brother." The mention of Leo made her flinch as if he'd struck her. "You will not speak about my brother. You have no right." "I know," he said, and the raw sincerity in his voice was undeniable. "What I did, it was inexcusable. It was arrogant and cruel, and I will regret it for the rest of my life. The world sees a video, a performance. They don't see the context. I do, and I am profoundly sorry." Alara stared at him, her chest tight. She had braced herself for arrogant justifications, for another dismissive offer of money. She had not expected this quiet, soul-deep shame. It disarmed her, but the anger was still there, a necessary shield against the man who had laid her soul bare for public consumption. "Your apology doesn't make the reporters disappear," she said, her voice sharp as broken glass. "It doesn't give me back my privacy. It doesn't change the fact that the world now looks at me with pity." "I want to help," Arthur said, stumbling back into his default mode of solving problems. "The Sterling Foundation, we can create a grant, a full scholarship to any conservatory in the world you choose. We can cover all of Leo's medical expenses. Indefinitely, all of it. Just name your price. I'll make this right." It was the worst possible thing he could have said. Alara's face, which had softened for a fraction of a second, hardened into stone. A bitter, mirthless laugh escaped her lips. "Name my price," she repeated, the words dripping with scorn. "You still don't get it. After everything you've learned, you still think this is a transaction. You think you can point your money cannon at this ugly thing you've created and blast it all away? My life, my brother's health, my music. It is not for sale, Mr. Sterling. It never was." She took a deep, shuddering breath, her eyes glittering with unshed tears of pure fury. "The $20,000 you paid me is covering 2 experimental treatments for my brother. That is the only transaction you and I will ever have. Thank you for that. And now I want you to leave, and I never ever want to see you again." She turned on her heel, walked to her building, and fumbled with her keys, her back ramrod straight. She didn't look back. Arthur stood alone on the sidewalk, the cold Chicago wind biting at his skin. He felt as though she had reached into his chest and squeezed his heart. "It's not for sale." The words echoed in the empty space inside him, a final, damning judgment. He had come to fix a problem the way he always did, with power, influence, and an open checkbook. And he had failed utterly. He had thought the music was her story. He was wrong. The music was just the prologue. Her real story was one of integrity, and he had just discovered it was the one currency he didn't possess and couldn't buy. As he walked back to his car, a cold certainty settled over him. A simple apology and a blank check wouldn't fix this. To make this right, he would have to change the very foundation of the world he had mastered. Arthur Sterling had not built upon his father's empire by accepting defeat. Alara's rejection, as absolute and scalding as it was, did not deter him. It recalibrated his entire strategy. The problem was not a financial deficit to be filled, but a moral bankruptcy to be reconciled. He returned to his world of glass and steel not with a sense of failure, but with a new, terrifyingly clear purpose. His first action was not a call to his lawyers or bankers. It was a private meeting, requested with an urgency that bordered on a command, with Dr. Lena Petrov, the head of the Shepherd Center's neurorehabilitation wing. He met her not in his imposing office, but in a small, neutral conference room at the hospital. He bypassed all pleasantries. Dr. Petrov, I am aware of your groundbreaking work in motor neuron therapies. I am also aware your research division is criminally underfunded. Dr. Petrov, a woman with weary eyes and a will of iron, was cautious. We do the best we can with the resources we have, Mr. Sterling. Your best isn't good enough, because you're hamstrung by budgets, Arthur stated, his tone not arrogant, but brutally pragmatic. I am prepared to endow a new research and treatment wing, the Sterling Center for Neuro-Artistic Restoration, state-of-the-art equipment, the top researchers in the field, fully funded clinical trials for the next decade, and an accompanying patient fund to ensure that no family ever has to choose between their home and their child's treatment. He paused, his gaze intense. My name will be on the building, but the fund will be administered anonymously. It will begin by retroactively covering the complete, lifelong care of a patient named Leo Vance. Dr. Petrov stared at him, speechless. She spent half her life writing grants and pleading with wealthy donors for five-figure sums. The amount Arthur was proposing, a 9-figure endowment, was paradigm-shifting. It was the kind of funding that saves not just one life, but generations of them. Mr. Sterling, this would change everything. Just say you'll accept it, Arthur said, his voice tight, and ensure that Leo Vance receives the best care humanity can devise, with cost being an irrelevant variable, effective immediately. Yes, Dr. Petrov breathed, her voice thick with emotion. Of course, yes. That was the first piece, the easy piece, the part that money could solve. The second was infinitely more complex. Alara had rejected his charity because it was a transactional apology, a way for him to assuage his guilt. He needed to create an opportunity, not a handout. He had to build a stage, not a gilded cage. He spent the next 2 weeks in a maelstrom of activity, leveraging his formidable network not for financial acquisition, but for artistic consultation. He met with the provost of Juilliard, the board of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, and renowned acousticians and architects. He wasn't buying talent. He was immersing himself in the world that had been stolen from Alara, learning its language, understanding its fragile ecosystem. He learned about the brutal economics of being a classical musician, the thousands of brilliant artists derailed by a single family crisis, a single medical bill. An idea began to take shape, something grand and audacious. It wasn't about one pianist. It was about all of them. His lawyer, the same older man from the restaurant, found him late one night in his office, surrounded not by financial projections, but by architectural blueprints for a new kind of building. I thought you'd be in Zurich for the banking summit, the lawyer Marcus Thorne said, loosening his tie. Postponed it, Arthur replied, not looking up. Look at this. He slid a thick proposal across the vast desk. The title read, The Cadenza Trust. Marcus read it, his eyebrows climbing higher with each page. It was a proposal for a new foundation, endowed with a staggering $250 million of Arthur's personal fortune. Its mission was twofold. First, to provide career interruption grants for promising young performing artists whose paths were threatened by personal or financial crisis. Second, to build a state-of-the-art performance and wellness center in the heart of Chicago, a place offering not just practice rooms and a concert hall, but also free physical therapy, mental health services, and financial counseling for artists. My God, Arthur, Marcus whispered, this is transformative. What brought this on? You heard what she played, Arthur said, finally looking up. His eyes were tired but held a clarity Marcus hadn't seen in years. That kind of talent shouldn't be left to the mercy of a random tragedy or the whim of a bored billionaire. This isn't charity, it's an investment in the human soul. He was building a world where someone like Alara Vance would never have to choose between her brother's life and her art again. While Arthur was quietly restructuring his universe, Alara was fighting a war of attrition. A few days after their confrontation, she received a call from Dr. Petrov. "Ilara, I have the most incredible news," the doctor said, her voice filled with a joy Ilara hadn't heard in years. "A new endowment has just been finalized. A massive one. The long and short of it is this. Leo's entire treatment plan, all of it, from today until the day he walks out of here, is completely covered." Ilara sank onto the edge of her bed, the phone pressed hard against her ear, as silent tears of overwhelming relief streamed down her face. For 3 years she had been Atlas, carrying the world on her shoulders. In a single phone call, the weight had vanished. She vaguely registered the name Sterling on the new wing, but assumed it was just another wealthy Chicago family. In a city of immense fortunes, she accepted it as a miracle, a moment of impossible grace. The crushing financial burden was lifted, but the weight of her squandered talent remained. The viral video had faded from the headlines, but its ghost lingered. She had received dozens of offers, of course, from agents, record labels, and orchestras, but they all felt tainted, products of the spectacle, not the music. They saw the story, not the artist. She ignored them all. But something had changed within her. With Leo's future secure, a tiny, fragile seed of her own future began to germinate. She used some of the money she'd saved to rent a small, soundproofed practice room by the hour at a local music school. The first time she sat before a real piano again, a worn-out Yamaha upright, her hands trembled. She moved through simple scales and exercises, her muscles screaming in protest, remembering the language her mind had tried to forget. It was clumsy. Her timing was off, her endurance a shadow of what it once was. But the muscle memory, the soul of the music, was there, buried deep. Each day she reclaimed a small piece of the woman she was supposed to be. It was during one of these sessions that a new player entered the game. Beatrice Croft had not forgotten her public humiliation at the Gilded Lyre. To be upstaged, to have her companion utterly captivated by a waitress, was an unforgivable insult. She had watched the waitress's viral fame with a curdled envy. Now, hearing whispers of Arthur's sudden, massive philanthropic shift toward the arts, she sensed an opportunity. She arranged to run into Arthur at a charity auction, approaching him with a predatory smile. "Arthur, darling, I was so heartbroken to hear about what you went through. That poor, unstable girl, putting you in such a position." "She is not unstable, Beatrice. She is a genius," Arthur said, his voice glacial. Beatrice's smile didn't waver. "Of course, a troubled genius. They so often go hand in hand. I've been doing some digging, out of concern. I have friends on the board at Juilliard. It seems our Miss Vance didn't just withdraw. She had a rather dramatic flame-out. Accusations of academic dishonesty, a physical altercation with a fellow student. They were going to expel her anyway. The family tragedy was just a convenient cover story." She patted his arm. "I just worry for you, darling. Your wonderful new foundation. You wouldn't want its first poster child to have such a sordid past. It would undermine everything." Arthur felt a cold prickle of unease. He knew Beatrice was a venomous gossip, but the details were specific, designed to sound plausible. He recognized her game immediately. She couldn't attack Ilara's talent, so she was trying to poison her character to reframe her as an unworthy recipient of his attention. "Thank you for your concern, Beatrice," Arthur said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "I will have my people look into it." He turned and walked away, a sense of foreboding settling over him. He was building an ark for artists like Ilara, but he knew that for every true talent, there were sharks like Beatrice Croft circling in the water, drawn by the scent of money and eager to pull everyone else down. He had created the spectacle that made Ilara a target, and he was beginning to realize his penance might involve protecting her from the very world he inhabited. The world that would rather destroy a prodigy than see her rise. The official launch of the Cadenza Trust was the most anticipated event of the Chicago social season. It was held not in a stuffy ballroom, but in the soaring modern atrium of a newly constructed building, the Trust's permanent home. Arthur Sterling, typically a phantom at such events, was the evening's host. He moved through the crowd, a man transformed. The arrogant sneer was gone, replaced by a quiet, focused intensity. He accepted congratulations from the city's elite, but his eyes kept drifting towards the entrance. He had sent a single personal invitation to Alara, delivered by courier to her apartment. It wasn't a summons, but a simple, respectful offering. Inside, on a plain white card, was a handwritten note. "This is not a cage. It is a stage. It's yours if you want it. No strings attached." He didn't know if she would come. He almost hoped she wouldn't, for her own sake. This room was filled with the very people who would have let her languish in obscurity. "Still no sign?" Marcus Thorne asked, appearing at his side. "No," Arthur said. "Perhaps it's for the best. What I've built here, it might not be enough to protect her from them." His thought was interrupted by the arrival of Beatrice Croft, a vision in crimson silk, a triumphant smirk on her face. "Arthur, darling," she purred, "what a magnificent achievement, a true testament to your generosity." Her eyes scanned the room. "I see your little project isn't here. Wise of her to stay away. I had my sources confirm the Juilliard story. It's even juicier than I thought. The journalist I spoke to is running it tomorrow morning. A full exposé." Arthur's blood ran cold. "What have you done, Beatrice?" "Me? I've done nothing but protect an old friend from making a terrible mistake," she said, her voice a sweet poison. "Reputation is everything, Arthur, and hers is about to be in tatters." Meanwhile, across town, Alara stood in her small apartment, the invitation in her hand. She had read Arthur's note 100 times. A stage. A part of her was terrified. His world was filled with predators like Beatrice, a woman whose casual cruelty she remembered vividly from the restaurant. But another stronger part of her was tired of hiding, tired of letting others define her. She had just finished a call with her brother, Leo. For the first time in years, his voice had been filled with genuine hope. He was starting a new therapy, he'd said, something cutting edge, all thanks to some anonymous donor. He told her he'd had a dream that he was playing the cello again. "You have to play for both of us now, Lara," he'd urged her. "Don't let them silence you." Her phone buzzed. It was a text from a friend, a violinist who was working as a caterer at the gala. "Watch out. A nasty journalist is here asking questions about you. Something about Juilliard. A woman named Beatrice Croft is feeding him stories." The final piece clicked into place. The sneering woman from the restaurant. The lies. They weren't just content to see her fail. They were actively trying to tear her down. The embers of the fire she'd felt at the Gilded Lyre roared back to life. But this time it was not a wild inferno, but a focused, white-hot flame. They thought she was unstable, a cheat, a victim. She looked at the simple black dress hanging on her door, the only nice thing she owned. Her quiet reclamation in the practice room was over. Hiding was over. She was not going to let a lie be the final word on her story. Beatrice Croft wanted to destroy a ghost. She was about to find out what it felt like to be haunted. Alara Petrova was going to the gala. She arrived not with a grand entrance, but like a whisper that grows into a storm. She slipped through a side door, her simple black dress a stark column of defiance against the glittering excess of the gala. The name Alara Vance was all it took for a panicked security guard to lead her backstage, where she found Arthur locked in a tense conversation with Marcus and a public relations specialist. He looked up as she entered, and the raw shock on his face was quickly eclipsed by something else: profound respect. "I saw the texts," she said, her voice steady and clear, devoid of any tremor of fear. "I know what Beatrice is doing. It's a lie." She met his gaze, and for the first time, they were not Billionaire and Waitress, but equals. "You offered me a stage. I'm here to use it." This was not the cornered woman from the restaurant. This was a warrior claiming her ground. Arthur turned to the bewildered stage manager. "The program has changed," he commanded, his voice ringing with an authority that tolerated no argument. "The keynote speech is canceled. Miss Vance will perform." In the grand atrium, Beatrice Croft was holding court, regaling a small circle with thinly veiled stories about an unstable musician. When the host's voice echoed from the speakers, it was Arthur. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice boomed, silencing the crowd. "The Cadenza Trust was founded on a simple principle, that true artistry should never be silenced. Tonight, we have been blessed with the presence of the very artist who inspired its creation. Please welcome Miss Alara Vance." A wave of murmurs swept the room. Beatrice's face went pale, her wine glass freezing halfway to her lips. A Steinway concert grand, the twin of the one from the Gilded Lyre, was already center stage. The spotlight found Alara as she walked from the wings. There was no rage in her posture this time, only a calm, unshakable poise. She sat at the piano, adjusted the bench, and let the silence of the massive room settle. Then she began to play. It was not the Rachmaninoff. It was a piece no one in the room had ever heard before. It began with a melody of heart-wrenching simplicity and sadness, a lament that spoke of loss and grief. It was the music of her past 3 years. But then the piece began to transform. The simple melody was joined by a second, more complex theme, one of resilience and growing strength. The two themes began to intertwine, a musical dialogue between sorrow and hope. Beatrice's lie was that Alara was a cheat, a fraud. But this music was irrefutable truth. It was an original composition, complex, brilliant, and breathtakingly honest. It was her story, told in her own voice. The technical difficulty of the piece was immense, a direct, elegant refutation of any notion that her talent wasn't genuine. A series of flawless, powerful runs up the keyboard mocked the idea that she was unstable. She was not just playing her pain, she was demonstrating her mastery over it. She ended not with a thunderous crash, but with a quiet, resolved chord that seemed to hang in the air, filled with a profound and gentle peace. She had taken the ugliest parts of her life and transfigured them into a thing of aching beauty. The silence that followed was not one of shock, but of deep, resonant awe. Then the atrium exploded. The applause was a tidal wave, a unanimous roar of approval and respect for an artist who had laid her soul bare and proven it to be magnificent. As Alara walked off the stage, her path intersected with Beatrice's. The socialite stood ashen-faced, a ghost at her own feast, her carefully constructed world shattered by a truth she could not comprehend. Alara met her eyes for a fleeting second, not with anger or triumph, but with a cool, dismissive pity. Her victory was so absolute, her rival was no longer relevant. She found Arthur waiting in the wings, the noise of the ovation still thundering behind them. The vast, complicated space between them, filled with money, shame, and power, had finally vanished. All that was left was two people who had seen the truth in each other. "Thank you," she said simply, "for the stage." "Thank you," he replied, his voice thick with an emotion she now understood was reverence. "For showing them all who you are." He didn't offer her a contract, a check, or an apology. He offered her something more vital. "The Cadenza Trust," he said, "needs an artistic director, someone who understands what it means to fight, someone who knows how to listen for the music behind the noise, someone who can build stages for others." He held out his hand. It was not a handout. It was not charity. It was an offer of partnership. She looked at his outstretched hand, then into his eyes. She saw not a billionaire, but a man who had been willing to tear down his own gilded cage to learn the value of something real. A man who, like her, was searching for a way to turn pain into purpose. She placed her hand in his. A new piece of music, a duet, was just beginning.